Gary, Indiana, August 29th, 1958. Michael Joseph Jackson is born. The eighth of 10 children, at the time of Michael's birth, the family had struggled to make ends meet. Michael's mother, Katherine Jackson, raised the enormous family almost single-handedly in this tiny 672 square foot home that you can still visit today on 2300 Jackson Street. Yep, that's the real name of the street. The house had just 2 bedrooms. The sons slept in bunk beds in one of the bedrooms, and the daughters all slept in the living room. One of Michael's younger brothers, Brandon, tragically died just a few months after he was born. To make ends meet, Katherine worked part-time at Sears. Michael's father, Joe Jackson, was a former boxer and crane operator at U.S. Steel. There are many reports that Joe was abusive to his kids, both mentally and physically. Despite all that, Joe was able to convince his 3 oldest sons, Jackie, Tito, and Jermaine, to start a band in 1964. Joe had been a musician himself, having performed with his younger brother, Luther, in a blues band called the Falcons. Katherine also had a musical background, playing both piano and clarinet, and singing. By the way, Jackie, Tito, and Jermaine all sang pretty well, as it turns out, especially after Katherine helped them learn how to harmonize. Tito began playing guitar, and Jermaine began playing the bass to form the Jackson Brothers. Joe saw their son's talents as a ticket out of poverty. He led a strict routine of rehearsing every day. Jackie, Tito, and Jermaine would often come home from school, rehearse for hours, eat dinner, do homework, and then go straight to bed. Their incredible work ethic began to pay off, though, as they got paying gigs at places like local grocery stores. Soon Joe realized that it would be beneficial if more of his sons joined the band. The Jacksons became the Jackson 5 after Michael and Marlon joined as singers. Michael wasn't even 6 years old yet when he began performing with his older brothers. And soon the family realized that he had the strongest voice of all the sons, and Joe made Michael the lead singer. Joe was particularly hard on Michael. Michael later recalled that his father both emotionally and physically abused him during rehearsals, apparently sitting in a chair with a belt in his hand, ready to punish him for any mistake. Michael later also said his dad made fun of him for having a, quote, fat nose. In 1966, the Jackson 5 won their first talent show at Theodore Roosevelt High School after Michael gave a breakout performance singing the song Barefoot by Robert Parker. There would be many talent show wins after this. For the next 2 years, the Jackson 5 toured the Midwest, often at bars and clubs, including strip bars, apparently. More appropriately, though, they played at local auditoriums and high school dances, and slowly began to get a following. On August 13th, 1967, while touring the East Coast, the Jackson 5 won the weekly amateur show at Harlem's legendary Apollo Theater. On November 21st, Joe was able to secure the Jackson 5's first record contract with Gordon Keith of Steeltown Records, a label based in Gary. Steeltown released the Jackson 5's debut single, Big Boy, on January 31st, 1968. Michael was 9 years old when his entire family gathered around the radio to hear the song broadcast for the very first time. While the single did not chart, it eventually sold more than 10,000 copies, and after that, the Jackson 5 was able to secure a deal with Motown Records, baby. Their first single with Motown, I Want You Back, did chart. In fact, it was a huge hit worldwide, shooting up to #1 on multiple charts. The Jackson 5 performed the song on their very first national television appearances, including a notable appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show on December December 14th, 1969. Around that time, Michael moved in with Diana Ross for a while. Ross would become a very influential person in his life. It didn't take long before the Jackson 5 were one of the biggest musical acts in the country. In fact, some say they were the original boy band. Michael Jackson, the undeniable star of the Jackson 5, with his incredible singing talent, found himself a huge celebrity at just 11 years old. The band followed up I Want You Back with 3 more #1 hits: ABC, The Love You Save, and I'll Be There. This success led to a phenomenon known as Jackson Mania, when the Jackson 5 regularly performed to sold-out concerts around the world, and they sold tens of millions of records. Soon, the Jackson 5 became Motown's most successful act, especially with the youngins. Young girls would often rush the stage at the concerts. I wish for once we could finish a show and not have to leave before the end because of the crowds rushing the stage, Michael once complained. We have a real good ending, but we never get the chance to do it. And while all 5 members shined, Michael was the biggest star of them all. As soon as 1971, around the time the Jacksons moved out to a large estate in Encino, California, Motown decided to launch a solo career for him. The label gathered the same team of producers who helped create songs with the Jackson 5 to record Michael's debut studio album, Got to Be There. Motown released the album on January 24th, 1972. Michael was 13 at the time. Got to Be There mostly rode the success of the Jackson 5, peaking at number 14 on the Billboard 200 chart. It featured 3 notable singles: the title track, I Wanna Be Where You Are, and Michael's rendition of a previous hit, Rockin' Robin, perhaps worried that his voice was going to get way deeper soon, dramatically changing his sound. Motown quickly had Michael record a follow-up to Got to Be There just months after recording it. Motown released Michael's second studio album, Ben, on August 4th, 1972. The title track was Michael's first #1 single as a solo artist. The album didn't do quite as well as Got to Be There, but critics did seem to like it more. Meanwhile, Michael still was a major part of the Jackson 5, despite their waning success. Michael's brother Jermaine also had a burgeoning solo career, and by 1972, Motown already was shifting its marketing by promoting Michael and Jermaine more than the Jackson 5. Randy, Michael's only younger brother, had also started performing with the group. When Michael's older brothers began hooking up with female fans, Michael did not. The prospect of hooking up with a girl seemed to terrify him, and few folks know that he was actually quite a lonely teenager. The 2 places where he didn't seem to be lonely: the stage and the studio. And strangely, as his speaking voice lowered, his singing voice, really didn't change that much. If anything, the older he got, the wider his range. It was truly a unique gift, and Motown noticed. The label got him into the recording studio for a 3rd album before his brother Jermaine. That 3rd album was Music and Me, released by Motown on April 13th, 1973. It featured 3 singles: the title track, With a Child's Heart, and Happy. Yeah, even though the cover featured Michael strumming an acoustic guitar, he most definitely did not play an instrument on this album. But, I mean, his one instrument, his voice, sounded better than ever. Critics generally praised Music and Me. Over the next couple years, the Jacksons all realized they were getting screwed over quite a bit by Motown and sought for a new record label. And despite less people buying their records, their music was becoming more ambitious. In June 1975, Joe Jackson was able to secure a much more lucrative contract with Sony's Epic Records, which gave the Jackson 5 more than 7 times the amount of potential royalties it was getting with Motown. That said, Jermaine stayed with Motown, likely due to him marrying Hazel Gordy, the daughter of Motown founder Berry Gordy. Motown got one more solo album out of Michael, Forever Michael, released on January 16th, 19th, 1975. It featured the singles We're Almost There, Just a Little Bit of You, and One Day in Your Life. With these songs, we heard Michael's voice as it would mostly sound for the rest of his life. Anyway, to get out of their obligations with Motown, the Jackson 5 changed their name to simply the Jacksons, and by this point, it wasn't just the sons who were performing. Michael's sisters, Rebby, LaToya, and Janet all could also sing. In fact, all of the Jackson kids except Jermaine performed to the world on a variety TV show called The Jacksons that aired between 1976 and 1977 on CBS. By then, though, it seemed Michael would soon be on a much different path than the rest of his family. In October 1977, he moved to New York City to play the Scarecrow in the musical The Wiz. Well, The Wiz flopped. It made little money and critics trashed it. During this time in New York City, Michael, now 19 years old, got introduced to early hip-hop. By this time, Michael was also writing his own songs and gaining more confidence. Not only that, he and his brothers once again had mainstream success with the release of their album Destiny, and that was the first album in which they all finally had full artistic control. Michael decided he wanted to once again have a solo career, setting out to record new stuff that sounded nothing like his stuff with his brothers. He teamed up with producer Quincy Jones and a new team of songwriters and recorded new songs in late 1978 and early 1979 that indeed marked a big departure from Michael's previous work with his brothers. These new songs mixed disco with funk and soul in ways no previous songs did. Epic Records was quite happy with the results, and the new songs made up what would become Michael's fifth studio album, Off the Wall, released on August 10th, 1979. Off the Wall was a groundbreaking release and still holds up as one of the greatest albums of all time. The album's success marked Michael's rapid rise into superstardom. Off the Wall peaked at number 3 on the Billboard 200, ultimately going on to sell more than 20 million copies worldwide. Critics also praised it, with many today calling it a landmark release of the entire disco era. Off the Wall featured 5 hit songs: Don't Stop Till You Get Enough, Rock With You, She's Out of My Life, Girlfriend, and the title track. Michael Jackson became the first solo artist in history to have 4 singles from the same album all reach the top 10 of the Billboard Hot 100. Off the Wall got Jackson his first Grammy for Best R&B Vocal Performance. He'd go on to win 12 more throughout his career. Now that Michael was a superstar around the world, he predictably left his brothers behind. Wait, what was that? Oh, no. He apparently didn't. In fact, he stuck right with them as they continued to tour and record, as if his solo career wasn't the biggest on the planet. By this point, Michael was incorporating more and more sophisticated dancing routines into performances. Well, while practicing these routines at a rehearsal in 1979, he accidentally fell off stage and broke his nose. This marked the first time he would get a nose job, and his nose would constantly be monitored by the media for the rest of his career, as he reportedly got several more nose jobs over the years. The Jacksons released Triumph on September 26, 1980. Michael contributed heavily to the songwriting process on this album, and it was another hit both critically and commercially. At every show on the tour to support Triumph, it was Michael's solo songs from Off the Wall that were the crowd favorites. In February 1981, Michael finally moved out on his own and bought a condo in Encino. He hesitated moving out of his parents' house for a while, though, and many say it was because he struggled with loneliness. He was 23 years old when he finally learned how to drive. Around that time, Jackson narrated the soundtrack to E.T. Also around that time, Jackson recorded some stuff with Freddie Mercury, the lead singer of Queen. Meanwhile, he was also recording more solo stuff, again working with Quincy Jones, and determined to make an album where, quote, every song was a killer. Well, that killer album ended up being Thriller, the best-selling album of all time. Jackson's sixth studio album, Epic released it on November 29th, 1982. Thriller was an immediate hit, becoming Jackson's first #1 album on the Billboard 200. It spent 37 weeks at #1 on that chart, and ultimately sold 70 million copies worldwide. You heard that right. 70 million copies. Holy crap. Not only is it the best-selling album of all time, it has sold more than 20 million copies more than the second best-selling album of all time. It sold 32 million by the end of 1983 alone. Anyway, critics also adored Thriller, with many saying it was Michael's defining album, the best album of his career. Thriller also set the record for the most top 10 singles from an album. Those songs were The Girl Is Mine, a duet he did with Paul McCartney, Billie Jean, Beat It, Wanna Be Startin' Something, Human Nature, Pretty Young Thing, and the title track, which, along with Billie Jean and Beat It, are Jackson's most popular songs today. The title track featured one of the greatest music videos of all time. The Thriller music video not only helped make Jackson a worldwide star, but also helped MTV itself become much more popular. The music video made music videos a more serious art form, and later became the first music video inducted into the United States National Film Registry by the Library of Congress. And finally, the music video established Jackson as arguably the most influential dancer in the world, with his zombie dance becoming popular at parties. On May 16th, 1983, Jackson performed Billie Jean, dancing in a way in which he glided backwards, but he looked like he was still going forward. Even though the dance had been around before this performance, Jackson doing it so well that night made it popular. And afterward, it became known as the Moonwalk, and he would incorporate it into many of his performances. Anyway, Thriller also won a record-breaking 8 Grammy Awards. Never before had a musical artist arguably been so culturally significant, especially with breaking down racial barriers. After all, Michael was an African American, and the majority of his listeners now were not. Quote, Michael Jackson is mass culture, not pop culture. He appeals to everybody, a radio station program director said. He appeals to all ages, and he appeals to every kind of pop listener. This kind of performer comes once in a generation. In November 1983, Jackson entered a partnership with Pepsi. He reportedly got around $15 million in today's money for the endorsement, which was unheard of for a pop star to do at the time. Regardless, it paid off. Really paid off. Pepsi ultimately made nearly $8 billion after that. So I'd say Pepsi got a good deal. On January 27th, 1984, Michael and some of his brothers were filming a Pepsi commercial when pyrotechnics accidentally caused some of his hair to catch on fire. This would cause second-degree burns to Michael's scalp, and he had surgery to hide the scars from it. Despite being the biggest pop star ever, Michael continued to record and release with his brothers. The Jacksons released Victory on July 2nd, 1984, and it was another smash success, mostly due to Michael. The Victory tour ended up being more like the Thriller tour, though. Michael finally left the group after this, and the group itself only lasted a few more years. In total, Michael recorded 15 studio albums with his brothers. Now that Michael was super rich, he began donating tons of money. Indeed, Michael eventually donated large sums of money to at least 39 different charity organizations over the years, more so than any other pop star in history. In early 1985, he made a song with Lionel Richie called We Are the World to raise money for those in poverty around the world. It was a huge success, earning around $175 million in today's money and becoming one of the best-selling singles of all time. Around this time, Jackson began buying the publishing rights to other people's songs. On August 10th, 1985, Jackson bought the publishing rights to most of the Beatles songs specifically. This proved to be quite a smart investment. That said, Michael would struggle with finance for most of his life. Sure, he made lots of money, but he usually spent way more than he brought in. In 1986, the tabloids had begun focusing on Michael's skin color. It was becoming lighter, even leading to widespread speculation that Jackson had been bleaching his skin. As it turns out, Jackson had vitiligo, a condition in which a person's immune system thinks melanin, or the stuff that gives our skin color, is bad, so it fights it off. He likely used a lot of makeup and possibly skin bleaching prescription creams to cover up uneven blotches of his skin caused by his vitiligo. But it wasn't just skin color that the tabloids focused on. Some reported that he had slept in a hyperbaric oxygen chamber to slow the aging process. Others reported he was anorexic since he had seemed to lose so much weight. Others said he took female hormone shots to keep his voice high, that he had cosmetic surgery on his eyes. Then, of course, there were the rumors that Jackson was gay. He consistently denied that. The September 15th, 1986 edition of The Sun labeled him Wacko Jacko. It was during all this tabloid craziness that Jackson returned to the studio to record his much-anticipated follow-up to Thriller. It took 2.5 years to record. Jackson had a much more hands-on role with the writing and producing process with this one, but once again returned with Quincy Jones as the lead producer. The result was another masterpiece from Jackson, his 7th studio album, Bad, released by Epic on August 31st, 1987. Fans had waited 5 years for a new album of original songs, and they were not disappointed. Bad debuted at number 1 on the Billboard 200, staying there for 6 consecutive weeks. It ultimately sold more than 35 million copies. Sure, that was just half of how many copies Thriller sold, but it is still the 12th best-selling album of all time and Jackson's 2nd highest. Bad was the first album in American history to produce 5 #1 singles. I Just Can't Stop Loving You, the title track, The Way You Make Me Feel, Man in the Mirror, and Dirty Diana. Man in the Mirror ultimately became the song that arguably not only defined his entire career, but was his finest song. As if all those songs weren't enough, Bad also featured the hits Smooth Criminal, Another Part of Me, and Leave Me Alone. Though he didn't need to, Jackson toured the world to support Bad. It was a bad tour. I mean, it was the Bad tour. Get it? Believe it or not, it was Jackson's first world tour. He performed 123 concerts in 15 countries to an estimated audience of 4.4 million people. The over 500,000 people who went to see 7 consecutive sold-out shows at London's Wembley Stadium was a world record for most people to attend one show. Often by his side on this tour, his pet chimpanzee, Bubbles, who was like a first child to Jackson. Jackson would often take Bubbles out and about with him. On February 1st, 1988, Jackson published his autobiography, which was edited by and featured a foreword by Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. In the book, Jackson opened up about the abuse he got from his father growing up and explained all of his dramatic appearance changes in recent years. Now 30 years old, Jackson finally decided to move away from his parents. In March, he bought a 2,700-acre ranch near Santa Ynez, California, about 2.5 hours northwest of Los Angeles. Jackson renamed his new home the Neverland Ranch, and it'd become one of the most famous homes of a public figure in the world. Jackson would build a private amusement park there that kids would regularly visit during the 1990s. Yeah, more on that that in a bit. Later that year, Warner Brothers released a collection of short musical films featuring Jackson, collectively known as Moonwalker. It was a box office hit. Jackson, the best-selling musician of the 1980s, attempted to keep a low profile after his bad tour ended. When he did go out and about, he wore ridiculous disguises. That summer, Jackson went back to the studio to begin recording a new album, this time working with producers Teddy Riley, Bill Bottrell, and Bruce Sweetian. Once again, Jackson was very hands-on with everything. This new stuff had much more of a New Jack Swing feel to it. Basically, it was definitely more influenced by hip-hop. The recording process would again be slow going. It once again took nearly 2.5 years to complete a new album. Part of the delay was because Jackson had been negotiating a renewed contract with Epic Records. Jackson ended up getting a record-breaking deal, the equivalent of nearly $150 million in today's money. On November 26, 1991, Epic finally released Jackson's 8th studio album, Dangerous. It debuted at number 1 on the Billboard 200 chart and spent 4 weeks total there. While critics were more mixed about it, Dangerous would be Jackson's 3rd best-selling album of all time, ultimately selling more than 32 million copies. It remains the 29th best-selling album of all time. Dangerous featured 4 top 10 hits: Remember the Time, In the Closet, Will You Be There, which was a prominent song on the Free Willy soundtrack, and Black or White. Other notable hits included Who Is It?, Jam, and Heal the World. Jackson went on another gigantic world tour to promote the album. All profits from it went to a wide range of charities, including Jackson's very own Heal the World Foundation, which primarily aimed to help end childhood poverty. The tour made more than $100 million. More than 3.5 million people attended its shows. Many of them were recorded and aired later in TV and film. Michael Jackson was in the spotlight quite a bit in 1993. It began with him urging the newly elected president, Bill Clinton, to give more money to HIV/AIDS charities. Soon after this, he performed at the Super Bowl 27 halftime show. It was the first Super Bowl halftime show they got a bigger viewership than the game itself. On February 10th, millions watched a vulnerable Michael in an interview with Oprah Winfrey. Meanwhile, his Heal the World Foundation also brought underprivileged kids to Neverland Ranch to test out his amusement park. Many of these children spent quite a bit of time in his home. He shared his bedroom with many of these children, later stating that these sleepovers were not sexual at all. Regardless, crazy rumors began to circulate, and in August 1993, a 13-year-old boy named Jordan Chandler accused Jackson of sexual abuse. Due to these allegations, police raided Jackson's Neverland Ranch and found, quote, art books that had nude children in them. Jackson's lawyers later argued that these books were irrelevant to the case, and long story short, Jackson's insurance company settled with the Chandler family in January 1994. The Chandlers got $23 million in the settlement. While the police never charged Jackson with any crimes due to a lack of evidence, this all certainly looked bad for Jackson, and because of this, he lost many fans. That said, many other fans determinedly stood by him and were particularly excited to see that he had finally, apparently, found a soulmate. That soulmate? None other than Lisa Marie Presley, the daughter of Elvis Presley. She was a singer and songwriter herself. They first met as kids and reunited as friends for a while before falling in love. The two married on May 26, 1994. Critics cynically thought the marriage was a publicity stunt meant to distract from the sexual abuse allegations. Still, the king of pop and the daughter of the king of rock seemed to legitimately dig each other.
And just think, nobody thought this would last.
And The marriage only lasted a year and a half, though. Meanwhile, Jackson had also developed an addiction to painkillers. In fact, he ended his world tour promoting Dangerous early due, in part, to that addiction. Also, meanwhile, he had been recording some new stuff. Much of this new stuff ended up on his 9th studio album, History, Past, Present, and Future, Book 1, which was actually also a greatest hits album. In its most popular format, the CD, it came out as 2 discs, with the first disc being the greatest hits album and the second being the new stuff. Epic released it on June 20th, 1995. Despite being expensive, I remember seeing it in some music stores for $30. History was another commercial success, eventually selling more than 20 million copies worldwide. Jackson's lyrics in History were highly personal and political. In fact, several of the songs referenced the sexual abuse allegations made against him. History featured the singles Childhood, Earth Song, This Time Around, They Don't Care About Us, Stranger in Moscow, and You Are Not Alone, which was the first song to ever debut at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 chart. It also featured a bunch of collaborations, including one in the hit Scream, a duet with Jackson's sister, Janet, who by now was quite a big star herself. Critics also generally praised History, and it won tons of awards. Jackson went on another world tour to promote it, and that tour ended up being the highest grossing solo tour of the 1990s and most attended tour of all time by a single artist. 4.5 million fans saw it, an average of around 55,000 people per show. It took place in 58 different cities in 35 different countries. It'd be his final world tour, though, and little did fans know that he'd hardly perform at all after it. During that tour, Jackson remarried to his friend Debbie Rowe. The two would have 2 children together, Prince and Paris. However, that marriage also didn't work out, only lasting about 3 years. On May 20th, 1997, Epic released Blood on the Dance Floor, History in the Mix, a remix album, mostly remixes of songs on History, but also new songs, including the hit Blood on the Dance Floor. Over the next 4 years, Jackson slowly recorded his 10th studio album. He worked with several different producers and recorded it at least 11 different studios. Oh, and apparently also spent $30 million on it. During this time, Jackson got into a label dispute with Sony, who owned Epic. Jackson had hoped to get the licenses to all of the masters of his recordings, but Sony had misled him, so this didn't happen. On March 19th, 2001, Jackson became the youngest person ever inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a solo artist. On September 7th and 10th, 2001, Jackson performed 2 big shows at Madison Square Garden in New York City to celebrate his 30th year as a solo artist. The shows were a huge success. Tickets sold out within 2 hours, with some tickets selling for more than $17,000 in today's money. CBS aired the concerts to an estimated 30 million viewers and later turned it into a concert film. On September 11th, 2001, the day after the second show, Michael was supposed to have a meeting at the World Trade Center. However, he overslept and missed the meeting, thus saving his life because, you know, it was 9/11. That was the day the towers got hit. Invincible, which Epic released on October 30th, 2001, is today considered the most expensive album ever made. Invincible was his final studio album before his death, and while it was another hit, it wasn't nearly as successful as his previous albums. That said, it did feature one top 10 single, You Rock My World, and 2 other singles, Butterflies and Cry. Jackson decided not to tour to promote the album, and Sony stopped promoting it, leading Jackson to call its CEO, Tommy Mottola, a racist, quote, devil who historically exploited African-American artists. Sony defended Mottola and soon parted ways with Jackson. On February 21st, 2002, Michael's 3rd child, Blanket, was born. An anonymous surrogate mother gave birth to him, him. For the rest of his life, Michael strongly protected his kids' privacy, even having them wear masks and veils when paparazzi were around. On April 24th, 2002, Jackson performed at the same place the Jackson 5 had won an amateur show 35 years prior at Harlem's legendary Apollo Theater. Though no one knew it at the time, this would be his final solo performance. The next month, a documentary film crew began following Jackson around as he lived his day-to-day life. The documentary, called Living with Michael Jackson, ended up airing on February 3rd, 2003. However, Jackson was not happy with how it turned out. In fact, in it, Jackson openly talks about sleeping in a bedroom with multiple children. I brought that up earlier. Well, yeah, this outraged many yet again and led to many more new sexual abuse accusations and investigations. On December 18th, 2003, Santa Barbara authorities arrested Jackson and charged him with 7 counts of child molestation and 2 counts of intoxicating a minor with alcoholic drinks. The trial didn't begin until early 2005. A jury found Jackson not guilty on all counts. Later, the FBI confirmed that it had no evidence of Jackson committing crimes. Regardless, the whole ordeal dramatically hurt Jackson's reputation, even more so than it got hurt back in 1993. Not only that, it caused his health to decline. After the trial, Jackson became much more of a recluse. In 2006, media outlets reported that Jackson was defending himself against 47 different lawsuits and had really bad debt. Yep, despite all that money he had earned from his music over the decades, he was about to go bankrupt. It got so bad that Jackson had to use his music publishing rights deal as collateral to borrow more money. To save money, he closed his Neverland ranch and moved to Bahrain to live with his friend Sheikh Abdullah. But even Sheikh Abdullah got fed up with his friend Jackson not paying him back, and Jackson spent the next 3 years living here and there or wherever he could as debt collectors followed his tracks. He now owed at least $500 million. Meanwhile, he had been trying to record new stuff here and there also, and had started planning a series of huge comeback concerts at the O2 Arena in London. Initially, ticket sales were promising and the hype was real, but on June 25th, 2009, less than 3 weeks before the concerts were to begin, Jackson was found dead at his rented mansion in Los Angeles. He was just 50 years old. The official cause of death was acute propofol intoxication. Put simply, he died from a drug overdose. As it turns out, Jackson's personal doctor, Conrad Murray, had given him the drugs to supposedly help him sleep. A jury later found Murray guilty of involuntary manslaughter, and he served 2 years in prison. Fans around the world were shocked and devastated about Jackson's death, especially as they had been looking forward to his comeback tours. An estimated 2.5 billion people watched his televised memorial service. Jackson's music all of a sudden was more popular than it had ever been before. In the year after his death, more than 35 million more copies of his albums were sold. That said, by this point in history, streaming services were now more popular than buying records, and so many of Jackson's songs suddenly became the most streamed songs on various sites. Since Jackson's death, others have made at least $600 million from his music, and it's an empire that isn't going away anytime soon. And yet, today, Michael Jackson's legacy is mixed. On one hand, he's still the king of pop for his overwhelming influence on modern pop music. Few in history have single-handedly had such an impact on culture. His songwriting, music, and singing and dancing style inspired multiple generations. At the time of the release of this video, Jackson had sold around 400 million copies of his albums worldwide, making him possibly the highest-selling solo artist in history. On the other hand, Jackson had a messed up personal life. At best, it was weird. At worst, it may have been as dark as it can get, man. In recent years, his reputation has further been tarnished by more allegations of sexual abuse of minors, as seen in the documentary Leaving Neverland. And so, despite his enormous success, Jackson will likely always be one of the most controversial public figures in history. Now, that doesn't mean we can't love his music, because his music, well, it continues to make the world a much better place. I felt like I didn't have to research this one as much since I grew up listening to Jackson's music and, well, I grew up being bombarded by his personal life too. So, what say you? Tell me what y'all really think about Michael Jackson in those comments. Also, which musician should I cover next? Thanks for watching.